one of the most beautiful, serene, witching places that ever was seen. High overhead are ranges of green rustling arches, through which the sun's rays come down to you in sparkles. You seem to be wandering through illimitable halls of pillars. Everywhere you catch glimpses of stately aisles, intersecting each other at all points. A strange silence, too, reigns far and near, the air flushed with the mellow stillness of a sunset. But after the long morning calms, the sea breeze comes in, and creeping over the tops of these 1,000 trees, they nod their plumes. Soon the breeze freshens, and you hear the branches brushing against each other, and the flexible trunks begin to sway. Toward evening the whole grove is rocking to and fro, and the traveler on the broom road is startled by the frequent falling of the nuts, snapped from their brittle stems. They come flying through the air, ringing like jugglers' balls, and often bound along the ground for many rods. Chapter LXX. Life at Luhulu. Finding the society at Luhulu very pleasant, the young ladies, in particular, being extremely sociable, and, moreover, in love with the famous good cheer of old Maorvai, we acquiesced in an invitation of his to tarry a few days longer. We might then, he said, join a small canoe party which was going to a place a league or two distant. So averse to all exertion are these people that they really thought the prospect of thus getting rid of a few miles walking would prevail with us, even if there were no other inducement. The people of the hamlet, as we soon discovered, formed a snug little community of cousins, of which our host seemed the head. Maorvai, in truth, was a petty chief who owned the neighboring lands. And as the wealthy, in most cases, rejoice in a numerous kindred, the family footing upon which everybody visited him was, perhaps, ascribable to the fact of his being the lord of the manor. Like Captain Bob, he was, in some things, a gentleman of the old school, a stickler for the customs of a past and pagan age. Nowhere else, except in Tamai, did we find the manners of the natives less vitiated by recent changes. The old-fashioned Tahitian dinner they gave us on the day of our arrival was a fair sample of their general mode of living. Our time passed delightfully. The doctor went his way, and I mine. With a pleasant companion, he was forever strolling inland, ostensibly to collect botanical specimens, while I, for the most part, kept near the sea, sometimes taking the girls on an aquatic excursion in a canoe. Often we went fishing, not dozing over stupid hooks and lines, but leaping right into the water, and chasing our prey over the coral rocks, spear in hand. Spearing fish is glorious sport. The Emeos, all round the island, catch them in no other way. The smooth shallows between the reef and the shore, and, at low water, the reef itself, being admirably adapted to this mode of capturing them. At almost any time of the day, save ever the sacred hour of noon, you may see the fish hunters pursuing their sport, with loud halloos, brandishing their spears, and splashing through the water in all directions. Sometimes a solitary native is seen, far out upon a lonely shallow, wading slowly along, with eye intent and poised spear. but the best sport of all is going out upon the great reef itself by torchlight. The natives follow this recreation with as much spirit as a gentleman of England does the chase, and take full as much delight in it. The torch is nothing more than a bunch of dry reeds, bound firmly together, the spear, a long, light pole, with an iron head, on one side barbed. I shall never forget the night that old Maorvai and the rest of us, paddling off to the reef, leaped at midnight upon the coral ledges with waving torches and spears. We were more than a mile from the land, the sullen ocean, thundering upon the outside of the rocks, dashed the spray in our faces, almost extinguishing the flambeau, and, far as the eye could reach, the darkness of sky and water was streaked with a long, misty line of foam, marking the course of the coral barrier. The wild fishermen, flourishing their weapons, and yelling like so many demons to scare their prey, sprang from ledge to ledge, and sometimes darted their spears in the very midst of the breakers. But fish spearing was not the only sport we had at Luhulu. Right on the beach was a mighty old coconut tree, the roots of which had been underwashed by the waves so that the trunk inclined far over its base. From the tuft of the tree a stout cord of bark depended, the end of which swept the water several yards from the shore. This was a Tahitian swing. A native lad seizes hold of the cord, and, after swinging to and fro quite leisurely, all at once sends himself 50 or 60 feet from the water, rushing through the air like a rocket. I doubt whether any of our rope dancers would attempt the feat. For my own part, I had neither head nor heart for it, so, after sending a lad aloft with an additional cord, by way of security, I constructed a large basket of green boughs, in which I and some particular friends of mine used to swing over sea and land by the hour. Chapter LXXI. We start for Talou. Bright was the morning, and brighter still the smiles of the young ladies who accompanied us, when we sprang into a sort of family canoe, wide and roomy, and bade adieu to the hospitable Maorvai and his tenantry. As we paddled away, they stood upon the beach, waving their hands, and crying out, "Aroha, aroha! Farewell, farewell," as long as we were within hearing. Very sad at parting with them, we endeavored, nevertheless, to console ourselves in the society of our fellow passengers. Among these were 2 old ladies, but as they said nothing to us, we will say nothing about them, nor anything about the old men who managed the canoe. But of the 3 mischievous, dark-eyed young witches who lounged in the stern of that comfortable old island gondola, I have a great deal to say. In the first place, one of them was Maorara, the bright-eyed, and, in the second place, neither she nor the Romps, her companions, ever dreamed of taking the voyage until the doctor and myself announced our intention. Their going along was nothing more than a madcap frolic. In short, they were a parcel of wicked hoydens, bent on mischief, who laughed in your face when you looked sentimental, and only tolerated your company when making merry at your expense. Something or other about us was perpetually awaking their mirth. Attributing this to his own remarkable figure, the doctor increased their enjoyment by assuming the part of a merry andrew. Yet his cap and bells never jingled but to some tune, and while playing the tomfool, I more than suspected that he was trying to play the rake. At home, it is deemed auspicious to go a-wooing in epaulets, but among the Polynesians, your best dress in courting is motley. A fresh breeze springing up, we set our sail of matting, and glided along as tranquilly as if floating upon an inland stream, the white reef on one hand, and the green shore on the other. Soon, as we turned a headland, we encountered another canoe, paddling with might and main in an opposite direction, the strangers shouting to each other, and a tall fellow in the bow dancing up and down like a crazy man. They shot by us like an arrow, though our fellow voyagers shouted again and again for them to cease paddling. According to the natives, this was a kind of royal mail canoe, carrying a message from the Queen to her friends in a distant part of the island. Passing several shady bowers which looked quite inviting, we proposed touching, and diversifying the monotony of a sea voyage by a stroll ashore. So, forcing our canoe among the bushes, behind a decayed palm lying partly in the water, we left the old folks to take a nap in the shade, and gallant the others among the trees, which were here trellised with vines and creeping shrubs. In the early part of the afternoon, we drew near the place to which the party were going. It was a solitary house inhabited by 4 or 5 old women, who, when we entered, were gathered in a circle about the mats, eating poee from a cracked calabash. They seemed delighted at seeing our companions, but rather drew up when introduced to ourselves. Eyeing us distrustfully, they whispered to know who we were. The answers they received were not satisfactory, for they treated us with marked coolness and reserve, and seemed desirous of breaking off our acquaintance with the girls. Unwilling, therefore, to stay where our company was disagreeable, we resolved to depart without even eating a meal. Informed of this, Maurora and her companions evinced the most lively concern, and equally unmindful of their former spirits, and the remonstrances of the old ladies, broke forth into sobs and lamentations which were not to be withstood. We agreed, therefore, to tarry until they left for home, which would be at the Rahehara or falling of the sun, in other words, at sunset. When the hour arrived, after much leave-taking, we saw them safely embarked. As the canoe turned a bluff, they seized the paddles from the hands of the old men, and waved them silently in the air. This was meant for a touching farewell, as the paddle is only waved thus when the parties separating never more expect to meet. We now continued our journey, and, following the beach, soon came to a level and lofty overhanging bank, which, planted here and there with trees, took a broad sweep round a considerable part of the island. A fine pathway skirted the edge of the bank, and often we paused to admire the scenery. The evening was still and fair, even for so heavenly a climate, and all round, as far as the eye could reach, was the blending blue sky and ocean. As we went on, the reef belt still accompanied us, turning as we turned, and thundering its distant bass upon the ear, like the unbroken roar of a cataract. Dashing forever against their coral rampart, the breakers looked, in the distance, like a line of rearing white chargers, reined in, tossing their white manes, and bridling with foam. These great natural breakwaters are admirably designed for the protection of the land. Nearly all the Society Islands are defended by them. Were the vast swells of the Pacific to break against the soft alluvial bottoms which in many places border the sea, the soil would soon be washed away, and the natives be thus deprived of their most productive lands. As it is, the banks of no rivulet are firmer. But the coral barriers answer another purpose. They form all the harbors of this group, including the 24 round about the shores of Tahiti. Curiously enough, the openings in the reefs, by which alone vessels enter to their anchorage, are invariably opposite the mouths of running streams, an advantage fully appreciated by the mariner who touches for the purpose of watering his ship. It is said that the fresh water of the land, mixing with the salts held in solution by the sea, so acts upon the latter as to resist the formation of the coral, and hence the breaks. Here and there, these openings are sentineled, as it were, by little fairy islets, green as emerald, and waving with palms. Strangely and beautifully diversifying the long line of breakers, no objects can strike the fancy more vividly. Pomeri too, with a taste in watering places truly Tahitian, selected one of them as a royal retreat. We passed it on our journey. Omitting several further adventures which befell us after leaving the party from Luhulu, we must now hurry on to relate what happened just before reaching the place of our destination. Chapter Xi. A dealer in the contraband. It must have been at least the 10th day, reckoning from the Hegira, that we found ourselves the guests of Vavi, an old hermit of an islander who kept house by himself perhaps a couple of leagues from Talu. A stone's cast from the beach there was a fantastic rock, moss-grown and deep in a dell. It was insulated by a shallow brook, which, dividing its waters, flowed on both sides until united below. Twisting its roots round the rock, a gnarled aoa spread itself overhead in a wilderness of foliage, the elastic branch roots depending from the larger boughs insinuating themselves into every cleft, thus forming supports to the parent stem. In some places these pendulous branches, half-grown, had not yet reached the rock, swinging their loose fibrous ends in the air like whiplashes. Vavi's hut, a mere coop of bamboos, was perched upon a level part of the rock, the ridgepole resting at one end in a crotch of the aoa and the other propped by a forked bough planted in a fissure. Notwithstanding our cries as we drew near, the first hint the old hermit received of our approach was the doctor's stepping up and touching his shoulder, as he was kneeling over on a stone cleaning fish in the brook. He leaped up, and stared at us. But with a variety of uncouth gestures, he soon made us welcome, informing us, by the same means, that he was both deaf and dumb. He then motioned us into his dwelling. Going in, we threw ourselves upon an old mat, and peered round. The soiled bamboos and calabashes looked so uninviting that the doctor was for pushing on to Talu that night, notwithstanding it was near sunset. But at length we concluded to stay where we were. After a good deal of bustling outside under a decrepit shed, the old man made his appearance with our supper. In one hand he held a flickering taper, and in the other, a huge, flat calabash, scantily filled with viands. His eyes were dancing in his head, and he looked from the calabash to us, and from us to the calabash, as much as to say, "Ah, my lads, what do ye think of this, eh? Pretty good cheer, eh?" But the fish and Indian turnip being none of the best, we made but a sorry meal. While discussing it, the old man tried hard to make himself understood by signs, most of which were so excessively ludicrous that we made no doubt he was perpetrating a series of pantomimic jokes. The remnants of the feast removed, our host left us for a moment, returning with a calabash of portly dimensions and furnished with a long, hooked neck, the mouth of which was stopped with a wooden plug. It was covered with particles of earth, and looked as if just taken from some place underground. With sundry winks and horrible giggles peculiar to the dumb, the vegetable demijohn was now tapped, the old fellow looking round cautiously, and pointing at it, as much as to intimate that it contained something which was taboo or forbidden. Aware that intoxicating liquors were strictly prohibited to the natives, we now watched our entertainer with much interest. Charging a coconut shell, he tossed it off, and then filling up again, presented the goblet to me. Disliking the smell, I made faces at it, upon which he became highly excited, so much so that a miracle was wrought upon the spot. Snatching the cup from my hands, he shouted out, "Ah, Kahauri Sabili Ena Avati Maitai," in other words, "What a blockhead of a white man! This is the real stuff." We could not have been more startled had a frog leaped from his mouth. For an instant, he looked confused enough himself, and then placing a finger mysteriously upon his mouth, he contrived to make us understand that at times he was subject to a suspension of the powers of speech. Deeming the phenomenon a remarkable one, every way, the doctor desired him to open his mouth so that he might have a look down. But he refused. This occurrence made us rather suspicious of our host, nor could we afterward account for his conduct, except by supposing that his feigning dumbness might in some way or other assist him in the nefarious pursuits in which it afterwards turned out that he was engaged. This conclusion, however, was not altogether satisfactory. To oblige him, we at last took a sip of his ava tea and found it very crude, and strong as a lucifer. Curious to know whence it was obtained, we questioned him, when, lighting up with pleasure, he seized the taper, and led us outside the hut, bidding us follow. After going some distance through the woods, we came to a dismantled old shed of boughs, apparently abandoned to decay. Underneath, nothing was to be seen but heaps of decaying leaves and an immense, clumsy jar, wide-mouthed, and by some means, rudely hollowed out from a ponderous stone. Here, for a while, we were left to ourselves, the old man placing the light in the jar, and then disappearing. He returned, carrying a long, large bamboo, and a crotched stick. Throwing these down, he poked under a pile of rubbish, and brought out a rough block of wood, pierced through and through with a hole, which was immediately clapped on the top of the jar. Then planting the crotched stick upright about 2 yards distant, and making it sustain one end of the bamboo, he inserted the other end of the latter into the hole in the block, concluding these arrangements by placing an old calabash under the farther end of the bamboo. Coming up to us now with a sly, significant look, and pointing admiringly at his apparatus, he exclaimed, "Ah, Kahari, Enahanahana Avati," as much as to say, "This, you see, is the way it's done." His contrivance was nothing less than a native still, where he manufactured his island pochine. The disarray in which we found it was probably intentional, as a security against detection. Before we left the shed, the old fellow toppled the whole concern over, and dragged it away piecemeal. His disclosing his secret to us thus was characteristic of the two Taiaris or contemners of the missionaries among the natives, who, presuming that all foreigners are opposed to the ascendancy of the missionaries, take pleasure in making them confidants, whenever the enactments of their rulers are secretly set at naught. The substance from which the liquor is produced is called tea, which is a large, fibrous root, something like yam, but smaller. In its green state, it is exceedingly acrid, but boiled or baked, has the sweetness of the sugar cane. After being subjected to the fire, macerated and reduced to a certain stage of fermentation, the tea is stirred up with water, and is then ready for distillation. On returning to the hut, pipes were introduced, and, after a while, Long Ghost, who, at first, had relished the Ava tea as little as myself, to my surprise, began to wax sociable over it, with Vavi, and, before long, absolutely got mellow, the old toper keeping him company. It was a curious sight. Everyone knows that, so long as the occasion lasts, there is no stronger bond of sympathy and good feeling among men than getting tipsy together. And how earnestly, nay, movingly, a brace of worthies, thus employed, will endeavor to shed light upon, and elucidate their mystical ideas. Fancy Vavi and the doctor, then, lovingly tippling, and brimming over with a desire to become better acquainted, the doctor politely bent upon carrying on the conversation in the language of his host, and the old hermit persisting in trying to talk English. The result was that, between the two, they made such a fricassee of vowels and consonants that it was enough to turn one's brain. The next morning, on waking, I heard a voice from the tombs. It was the doctor solemnly pronouncing himself a dead man. He was sitting up, with both hands clasped over his forehead, and his pale face 1,000 times paler than ever. "That infernal stuff has murdered me," he cried. "Heavens, my head's all wheels and springs, like the automaton chess player. What's to be done, Paul? I'm poisoned." But, after drinking a herbal draught concocted by our host, and eating a light meal, at noon, he felt much better, so much so that he declared himself ready to continue our journey. When we came to start, the Yankee's boots were missing, and, after a diligent search, were not to be found. Enraged beyond measure, their proprietor said that Vavi must have stolen them, but, considering his hospitality, I thought this extremely improbable, though to whom else to impute the theft I knew not. The doctor maintained, however, that one who was capable of drugging an innocent traveler with tea was capable of anything. But it was in vain that he stormed, and Vavi and I searched. The boots were gone. Were it not for this mysterious occurrence, and Vavi's detestable liquors, I would here recommend all travellers going round by the beach to Patuau to stop at the rock, and patronize the old gentleman, the more especially as he entertains gratis. Chapter LXXIII. Our reception in Patuau. Upon starting, at last, I flung away my sandals, by this time quite worn out, with the view of keeping company with the doctor, now forced to go barefooted. Recovering his spirits in good time, he protested that boots were a bore after all, and going without them decidedly manly. This was said, be it observed, while strolling along over a soft carpet of grass, a little moist, even at midday, from the shade of the wood through which we were passing. Emerging from this we entered upon a blank, sandy tract, upon which the sun's rays fairly flashed, making the loose gravel underfoot well nigh as hot as the floor of an oven. Such yelling and leaping as there was in getting over this ground would be hard to surpass. We could not have crossed at all, until toward sunset, had it not been for a few small, wiry bushes growing here and there, into which we every now and then thrust our feet to cool. There was no little judgment necessary in selecting your bush, for if not chosen judiciously, the chances were that, on springing forward again, and finding the next bush so far off that an intermediate cooling was indispensable, you would have to run back to your old place again. Safely passing the Sahara, or fiery desert, we soothed our half-blistered feet by a pleasant walk through a meadow of long grass, which soon brought us in sight of a few straggling houses, sheltered by a grove on the outskirts of the village of Patuau. My comrade was for entering the first one we came to, but, on drawing near, they had so much of an air of pretension, at least for native dwellings, that I hesitated, thinking they might be the residences of the higher chiefs, from whom no very extravagant welcome was to be anticipated. While standing irresolute, a voice from the nearest house hailed us, "Aramai, Aramai, Kahawari. Come in, strangers." We at once entered, and were warmly greeted. The master of the house was an aristocratic-looking islander, dressed in loose linen drawers, a fine white shirt, and a sash of red silk tied about the waist, after the fashion of the Spaniards in Chile. He came up to us with a free, frank air, and, striking his chest with his hand, introduced himself as Remir Popo, or, to render the Christian name back again into English, Jeremiah Popo. These curious combinations of names among the people of the Society Islands originate in the following way. When a native is baptized, his patronymic often gives offense to the missionaries, and they insist upon changing to something else whatever is objectionable therein. So, when Jeremiah came to the font, and gave his name as Namonana Popo, something equivalent to the Dera of Devils by Night, the reverend gentleman officiating told him that such a heathenish appellation would never do, and a substitute must be had, at least for the devil part of it. Some highly respectable Christian appellations were then submitted, from which the candidate for admission into the church was at liberty to choose. There was Adamo, Adam, Noah, Noah, Davida, David, Ichabod, James, Iona, John, Patora, Peter, Remia, Jeremiah, etc. And thus did he come to be named Jeremiah Popo, or Jeremiah in the dark, which he certainly was, I fancy, as to the ridiculousness of his new cognomen. We gave our names in return, upon which he bade us be seated, and, sitting down himself, asked us a great many questions, in mixed English and Tahitian. After giving some directions to an old man to prepare food, our host's wife, a large, benevolent-looking woman, upwards of 40, also sat down by us. In our soiled and travel-stained appearance, the good lady seemed to find abundant matter for commiseration, and all the while kept looking at us piteously, and making mournful exclamations. But Jeremiah and his spouse were not the only inmates of the mansion. In one corner, upon a large native couch, elevated upon posts, reclined a nymph, who, half veiled in her own long hair, had yet to make her toilet for the day. She was the daughter of Popo, and a very beautiful little daughter she was, not more than 14, with the most delightful shape, like a bud just blown, and large hazel eyes. They called her Lou, a name rather pretty and genteel, and therefore quite appropriate, for a more genteel and ladylike little damsel there was not in all Omoo. She was a cold and haughty young beauty though, this same little Lou, and never deigned to notice us, further than now and then to let her eyes float over our persons, with an expression of indolent indifference. With the tears of the Luhulu girls hardly dry from their sobbing upon our shoulders, this contemptuous treatment stung us not a little. When we first entered, Popo was raking smooth the carpet of dried ferns which had that morning been newly laid, and now that our meal was ready, it was spread on a banana leaf, right upon this fragrant floor. Here we lounged at our ease, eating baked pig and breadfruit off earthen plates, and using, for the first time in many a long month, real knives and forks. These, as well as other symptoms of refinement, somewhat abated our surprise at the reserve of the little Lou. Her parents, doubtless, were magnates in Patuaui, and she herself was an heiress. After being informed of our stay in the Vale of Martyr, they were very curious to know on what errand we came to Talu. We merely hinted that the ship lying in the harbor was the reason of our coming. Our Fretty, Popo's wife, was a right motherly body. The meal over, she recommended a nap, and upon our waking much refreshed, she led us to the doorway, and pointed down among the trees, through which we saw the gleam of water. Taking the hint, we repaired thither, and finding a deep shaded pool, bathed, and returned to the house. Our hostess now sat down by us, and after looking with great interest at the doctor's cloak, felt of my own soiled and tattered garments for the 100th time, and exclaimed plaintively, "Ah nui oli mani, oli mani." Alas, they are very, very old, very old. When our Fretty, good soul, thus addressed us, she thought she was talking very respectable English. The word Niue is so familiar to foreigners throughout Polynesia, and is so often used by them in their intercourse with the natives, that the latter suppose it to be common to all mankind. Olimani is the native pronunciation of Old Man which, by Society Islanders talking Saxon, is applied indiscriminately to all aged things and persons whatsoever. Going to a chest filled with various European articles, she took out 2 suits of new sailor frocks and trousers, and presenting them with a gracious smile, pushed us behind a calico screen, and left us. Without any fastidious scruples, we donned the garments, and what with the meal, the nap, and the bath, we now came forth like a couple of bridegrooms. Evening drawing on, lamps were lighted. They were very simple, the half of a green melon, about 1/3 full of coconut oil, and a wick of twisted tapa floating on the surface. As a night lamp, this contrivance cannot be excelled, a soft dreamy light being shed through the transparent rind. As the evening advanced, other members of the household, whom as yet we had not seen, began to drop in. There was a slender young dandy in a gay striped shirt, and whole fathoms of bright-figured calico tucked about his waist, and falling to the ground. He wore a new straw hat also with 3 distinct ribbons tied about the crown, 1 black, 1 green, and 1 pink. Shoes or stockings, however, he had none. There were a couple of delicate, olive-cheeked little girls, twins, with mild eyes and beautiful hair, who ran about the house, half naked, like a couple of gazelles. They had a brother, somewhat younger, a fine dark boy, with an eye like a woman's. All these were the children of Popo, begotten in lawful wedlock. Then there were 2 or 3 queer-looking old ladies, who wore shabby mantles of soiled sheeting, which fitted so badly, and withal had such a second-hand look that I at once put their wearers down as domestic paupers, poor relations, supported by the bounty of my Lady Arfreti. They were sad, meek old bodies, said little and ate less, and either kept their eyes on the ground, or lifted them up deferentially. The semi-civilization of the island must have had something to do with making them what they were. I had almost forgotten Money, the grinning old man who prepared our meal. His head was a shining, bald globe. He had a round little paunch, and legs like a cat. He was Popo's factotum, cook, butler, and climber of the breadfruit and coconut trees, and, added to all else, a mighty favorite with his mistress, with whom he would sit smoking and gossiping by the hour. Often you saw the indefatigable Money working away at a great rate, then dropping his employment all at once, never mind what, run off to a little distance, and after rolling himself away in a corner and taking a nap, jump up again, and fall to with fresh vigor. From a certain something in the behavior of Popo and his household, I was led to believe that he was a pillar of the church, though, from what I had seen in Tahiti, I could hardly reconcile such a supposition with his frank, cordial, unembarrassed air. But I was not wrong in my conjecture. Popo turned out to be a sort of elder, or deacon. He was also accounted a man of wealth, and was nearly related to a high chief. Before retiring, the entire household gathered upon the floor, and in their midst, he read aloud a chapter from a Tahitian Bible. Then kneeling with the rest of us, he offered up a prayer. Upon its conclusion, all separated without speaking. These devotions took place regularly, every night and morning. Grace too was invariably said, by this family, both before and after eating. After becoming familiarized with the almost utter destitution of anything like practical piety upon these islands, what I observed in our host's house astonished me much. But whatever others might have been, Popo was, in truth, a Christian, the only one, Arfreti excepted, whom I personally knew to be such, among all the natives of Polynesia. Chapter 6. Retiring for the night, the doctor grows devout. They put us to bed very pleasantly. Lying across the foot of Popo's nuptial couch was a smaller one made of core wood, a thin, strong cord, twisted from the fibers of the husk of the coconut, and woven into an exceedingly light sort of network, forming its elastic body. Spread upon this was a single, fine mat, with a roll of dried ferns for a pillow, and a strip of white tapa for a sheet. This couch was mine. The doctor was provided for in another corner. Lou reposed alone on a little settee with a taper burning by her side, the dandy, her brother, swinging overhead in a sailor's hammock. The two gazelles frisked upon a mat nearby, and the indigent relations borrowed a scant corner of the old butler's pallet, who snored away by the open door. After all had retired, Popo placed the illuminated melon in the middle of the apartment, and so, we all slumbered till morning. Upon awaking, the sun was streaming brightly through the open bamboos, but no one was stirring. After surveying the fine attitudes into which forgetfulness had thrown at least one of the sleepers, my attention was called off to the general aspect of the dwelling, which was quite significant of the superior circumstances of our host. The house itself was built in the simple, but tasteful native style. It was a long, regular oval, some 50 feet in length, with low sides of cane work, and a roof thatched with palmetto leaves. The ridgepole was, perhaps, 20 feet from the ground. There was no foundation whatever, the bare earth being merely covered with ferns, a kind of carpeting which serves very well, if frequently renewed. Otherwise, it becomes dusty, and the haunt of vermin, as in the huts of the poorer natives. Besides the couches, the furniture consisted of 3 or 4 sailor chests, in which were stored the fine wearing apparel of the household, the ruffled linen shirts of Popo, the calico dresses of his wife and children, and divers odds and ends of European articles, strings of beads, ribbons, Dutch looking-glasses, knives, coarse prints, bunches of keys, bits of crockery, and metal buttons. One of these chests, used as a bandbox by Arfreti, contained several of the native hats, coal scuttles, all of the same pattern, but trimmed with variously colored ribbons. Of nothing was our good hostess more proud than of these hats, and her dresses. On Sundays, she went abroad a dozen times, and every time, like Queen Elizabeth, in a different robe. Popo, for some reason or other, always gave us our meals before the rest of the family were served, and the doctor, who was very discerning in such matters, declared that we fared much better than they. Certain it was that, had Remir's guests travelled with purses, portmanteau, and letters of introduction to the Queen, they could not have been better cared for. The day after our arrival, Money, the old butler, brought us in for dinner a small pig, baked in the ground. All savoury, it lay in a wooden trencher, surrounded by roasted hemispheres of the breadfruit. A large calabash, filled with taro pudding, or poi, followed, and the young dandy, overcoming his customary languor, threw down our coconuts from an adjoining tree. When all was ready, and the household looking on, Long Ghost, devoutly clasping his hands over the fated pig, implored a blessing. Hereupon, everybody present looked exceedingly pleased, Popo coming up and addressing the doctor with much warmth, and Afreti, regarding him with almost maternal affection, exclaimed delightedly, "Ah, Mikanari Tata Matei," in other words, "What a pious young man." It was just after this meal that she brought me a roll of grass sinnate, of the kind which sailors sew into the frame of their tarpaulins, and then, handing me needle and thread, bade me begin at once, and make myself the hat which I so much needed. An accomplished hand at the business, I finished it that day, merely stitching the braid together, and Afreti, by way of rewarding my industry, with her own olive hands ornamented the crown with a band of flame-colored ribbon, the two long ends of which streaming behind, sailor fashion, still preserved for me the Eastern title bestowed by Long Ghost. Chapter LXXV. A ramble through the settlement the following morning, making our toilets carefully, we donned our sombreros, and sallied out on a tour. Without meaning to reveal our designs upon the court, our principal object was, to learn what chances there were for white men to obtain employment under the Queen. On this head, it is true, we had questioned Popo, but his answers had been very discouraging, so we determined to obtain further information elsewhere. But, first, to give some little description of the village. The settlement of Patuau is nothing more than some 80 houses, scattered here and there, in the midst of an immense grove, where the trees have been thinned out and the underbrush cleared away. Through the grove flows a stream, and the principal avenue crosses it, over an elastic bridge of coconut trunks, laid together side by side. The avenue is broad, and serpentine, well shaded from one end to the other, and as pretty a place for a morning promenade as any lounger could wish. The houses, constructed without the slightest regard to the road, peep into view from among the trees on either side, some looking you right in the face as you pass, and others, without any manners, turning their backs. Occasionally you observe a rural retreat, enclosed by a picket of bamboos, or with a solitary pane of glass massively framed in the broad side of the dwelling, or with a rude, strange-looking door, swinging upon dislocated wooden hinges. Otherwise, the dwellings are built in the original style of the natives, and never mind how mean and filthy some of them may appear within, they all look picturesque enough without. As we sauntered along, the people we met saluted us pleasantly, and invited us into their houses, and in this way we made a good many brief morning calls. But the hour could not have been the fashionable one in Partuaje, since the ladies were invariably in dishabille. But they always gave us a cordial reception, and were particularly polite to the doctor, caressing him, and amorously hanging about his neck, wonderfully taken up, in short, with a gay handkerchief he wore there. Our Fretty had that morning bestowed it upon the pious youth. With some exceptions, the general appearance of the natives of Partuaje was far better than that of the inhabitants of Papeete, a circumstance only to be imputed to their restricted intercourse with foreigners. Strolling on, we turned a sweep of the road, when the doctor gave a start, and no wonder. Right before us, in the grove, was a block of houses, regular square frames, boarded over, furnished with windows and doorways, and 2 stories high. We ran up and found them fast going to decay, very dingy, and here and there covered with moss, no sashes, no doors, and on one side, the entire block had settled down nearly a foot. On going into the basement we looked clean up through the unbearded timbers to the roof, where rays of light, glimmering through many a chink, illuminated the cobwebs which swung all round. The whole interior was dark and close. Burrowing among some old mats in one corner, like a parcel of gypsies in a ruin, were a few vagabond natives. They had their dwelling here. Curious to know who on earth could have been thus trying to improve the value of real estate in Partuaje, we made inquiries, and learned that some years previous the block had been thrown up by a veritable Yankee. One might have known that, a house carpenter by trade, and a bold, enterprising fellow by nature. Put ashore from his ship, sick, he first went to work and got well, then sallied out with chisel and plane, and made himself generally useful. A sober, steady man, it seems, he at last obtained the confidence of several chiefs, and soon filled them with all sorts of ideas concerning the alarming want of public spirit in the people of Omoo. More especially did he dwell upon the humiliating fact of their living in paltry huts of bamboo, when magnificent palaces of boards might so easily be mortised together. In the end, these representations so far prevailed with one old chief that the carpenter was engaged to build a batch of these wonderful palaces. Provided with plenty of men, he at once set to work, built a sawmill among the mountains, felled trees, and sent over to Papeete for nails. Presto! The castle rose, but alas, the roof was hardly on, when the Yankee's patron, having speculated beyond his means, broke all to pieces, and was absolutely unable to pay 1 plug of tobacco in the pound. His failure involved the carpenter, who sailed away from his creditors in the very next ship that touched at the harbor. The natives despised the rickety palace of boards, and often lounged by, wagging their heads, and jeering. We were told that the Queen's residence was at the extreme end of the village, so, without waiting for the doctor to procure a fiddle, we suddenly resolved upon going thither at once, and learning whether any privy councilorships were vacant. Now, although there was a good deal of my waggish comrade's nonsense about what has been said concerning our expectations of court preferment, we, nevertheless, really thought that something to our advantage might turn up in that quarter. On approaching the palace grounds, we found them rather peculiar. A broad pier of hewn coral rocks was built right out into the water, and upon this, and extending into a grove adjoining, were some 8 or 10 very large native houses, constructed in the handsomest style and enclosed together by a low picket of bamboos, which embraced a considerable area. Throughout the Society Islands, the residences of the chiefs are mostly found in the immediate vicinity of the sea, a site which gives them the full benefit of a cooling breeze, nor are they so liable to the annoyance of insects, besides enjoying, when they please, the fine shade afforded by the neighboring groves, always most luxuriant near the water. Lounging about the grounds were some 60 or 80 handsomely dressed natives, men and women, some reclining on the shady side of the houses, others under the trees, and a small group conversing close by the railing facing us. We went up to the latter, and giving the usual salutation, were on the point of vaulting over the bamboos, when they turned upon us angrily, and said we could not enter. We stated our earnest desire to see the Queen, hinting that we were bearers of important dispatches. But it was to no purpose, and not a little vexed, we were obliged to return to Popo's without effecting anything. Chapter XV. An island jilt. We visit the ship. Upon arriving home we fully laid open to Popo our motives in visiting Talou, and begged his friendly advice. In his broken English he cheerfully gave us all the information we needed. It was true, he said, that the Queen entertained some idea of making a stand against the French, and it was currently reported also that several chiefs from Bora, Hawaii, Rotare, and Taha, the leeward islands of the group, were at that very time taking counsel with her as to the expediency of organizing a general movement throughout the entire cluster, with a view of anticipating any further encroachments on the part of the invaders. Should warlike measures be actually decided upon, it was quite certain that Pomeri would be glad to enlist all the foreigners she could, but as to her making officers of either the doctor or me, that was out of the question, because, already, a number of Europeans, well known to her, had volunteered as such. Concerning our getting immediate access to the Queen, Popo told us it was rather doubtful, she living at that time very retired, in poor health and spirits, and averse to receiving calls. Previous to her misfortunes, however, no one, however humble, was denied admittance to her presence. Sailors, even, attended her levees. Not at all disheartened by these things, we concluded to kill time in Patouao until some event turned up more favorable to our projects. So that very day we sallied out on an excursion to the ship which, lying landlocked far up the bay, yet remained to be visited. Passing on our route along Low Shed, a voice hailed us, "White men ahoy!" Turning round, who should we see but a rosy-cheeked Englishman, you could tell his country at a glance, up to his knees in shavings, and planing away at a bench. He turned out to be a runaway ship's carpenter, recently from Tahiti, and now doing a profitable business in Omoo, by fitting up the dwellings of opulent chiefs with cupboards and other conveniences, and once in a while trying his hand at a lady's workbox. He had been in the settlement but a few months, and already possessed houses and lands. But though blessed with prosperity and high health, there was one thing wanting, a wife. And when he came to speak of the matter, his countenance fell, and he leaned dejectedly upon his plane. "It's too bad," he sighed, "to wait 3 long years, and all the while, dear little Lully living in the same house with that infernal chief from Taha." Our curiosity was piqued. The poor carpenter, then, had been falling in love with some island coquette, who was going to jilt him. But such was not the case. There was a law prohibiting, under a heavy penalty, the marriage of a native with a foreigner, unless the latter, after being 3 years a resident on the island, was willing to affirm his settled intention of remaining for life. William was therefore in a sad way. He told us that he might have married the girl 6 times, had it not been for this odious law, but, latterly, she had become less loving and more giddy, particularly with the strangers from Taha. Desperately smitten, and desirous of securing her at all hazards, he had proposed to the damsel's friends a nice little arrangement, introductory to marriage, but they would not hear of it. Besides, if the pair were discovered living together upon such a footing, they would be liable to a degrading punishment, sent to work making stone walls and opening roads for the Queen. Dr. Longghost was all sympathy. "Bill, my good fellow," said he, tremulously, "let me go and talk to her." But Bill, declining the offer, would not even inform us where his charmer lived. Leaving the disconsolate Willie planing a plank of New Zealand pine, an importation from the Bay of Islands, and thinking the while of Lully, we went on our way. How his suit prospered in the end we never learned. Going from Popo's house toward the anchorage of the harbour of Talou, you catch no glimpse of the water until, coming out from deep groves, you all at once find yourself upon the beach. A bay, considered by many voyagers the most beautiful in the South Seas, then lies before you. You stand upon one side of what seems a deep green river, flowing through mountain passes to the sea. Right opposite a majestic promontory divides the inlet from another, called after its discoverer, Captain Cook. The face of this promontory toward Talou is one verdant wall, and at its base the waters lie still and fathomless. On the left hand, you just catch a peep of the widening mouth of the bay, the break in the reef by which ships enter, and, beyond, the sea. To the right, the inlet, sweeping boldly round the promontory, runs far away into the land, where, save in one direction, the hills close in on every side, knee-deep in verdure and shooting aloft in grotesque peaks. The open space lies at the head of the bay. In the distance it extends into a broad hazy plain lying at the foot of an amphitheatre of hills. Here is the large sugar plantation previously alluded to. Beyond the first range of hills, you descry the sharp pinnacles of the interior, and among these, the same silent marling spike which we so often admired from the other side of the island. All alone in the harbour lay the good ship Leviathan. We jumped into the canoe, and paddled off to her. Though early in the afternoon, Everything was quiet, but upon mounting the side we found 4 or 5 sailors lounging about the forecastle, under an awning. They gave us no very cordial reception, and though otherwise quite hearty in appearance, seemed to assume a look of ill humor on purpose to honor our arrival. There was much eagerness to learn whether we wanted to ship, and by the unpleasant accounts they gave of the vessel, they seemed desirous to prevent such a thing if possible. We asked where the rest of the ship's company were. A gruff old fellow made answer, "One boat's crew of 'em is gone to Davy Jones's locker, went off after a whale, last cruise, and never come back again. All the starboard watch ran away last night, and the skipper's ashore kitching 'em." "And it's shipping you're after, my jewels, is it?" cried a curly-pated little Belfast sailor, coming up to us. "Thinnerer, my livelies, jist be after sailing ashore in a jiffy. The devil of a skipper will carry yees both to sea, whether or no. Be off wid ye thin, darlints, and steer clear of the likes of this ballyhoo of blazes as long as ye live. They murther us here every day, and starve us into the bargain. Here, Dick, lad, ha! The poor devils can now alongside, and paddle away wid yees for dear life." But we loitered a while, listening to more inducements to ship, and at last concluded to stay to supper. My sheath knife never cut into better sea beef than that which we found lying in the kid in the forecastle. The bread, too, was hard, dry, and brittle as glass, and there was plenty of both. While we were below, the mate of the vessel called out for someone to come on deck. I liked his voice. Hearing it was as good as a look at his face. It betokened a true sailor, and no taskmaster. The appearance of the Leviathan herself was quite pleasing. Like all large, comfortable old whalers, she had a sort of motherly look, broad in the beam, flush decks, and 4 chubby boats hanging at the breast. Her sails were furled loosely upon the yards, as if they had been worn long, and fitted easy. Her shrouds swung negligently slack, and as for the running rigging, it never worked hard as it does in some of your dandy ships, jamming in the sheaves of blocks, like Chinese slippers, too small to be useful. On the contrary, the ropes ran glibly through, as if they had many a time travelled the same road, and were used to it. When evening came, we dropped into our canoe, and paddled ashore, fully convinced that the good ship never deserved the name which they gave her. Chaptalksay. A party of rovers, Little Lou and the doctor. While in Partuauye, we fell in with a band of 6 veteran rovers, prowling about the village and harbour, who had just come overland from another part of the island. A few weeks previous, they had been paid off, at Papeete, from a whaling vessel, on board of which they had, 6 months before, shipped for a single cruise, that is to say, to be discharged at the next port. Their cruise was a famous one, and each man stepped upon the beach at Tahiti jingling his dollars in a sock. Weary at last of the shore, and having some money left, they clubbed, and purchased a sailboat, proposing a visit to a certain uninhabited island, concerning which they had heard strange and golden stories. Of course, they never could think of going to sea without a medicine chest filled with flasks of spirits, and a small cask of the same in the hold in case the chest should give out. Away they sailed, hoisted a flag of their own, and gave 3 times 3, as they staggered out of the Bay of Papeete with a strong breeze, and under all the muslin they could carry. Evening coming on, and feeling in high spirits and no ways disposed to sleep, they concluded to make a night of it, which they did, all hands getting tipsy, and the 2 masts going over the side about midnight, to the tune of sailing down, on the coast of Barbary. Fortunately, one worthy could stand by holding on to the tiller, and the rest managed to crawl about, and hack away the lanyards of the rigging, so as to break clear from the fallen spars. While thus employed, 2 sailors got tranquilly over the side, and went plumb to the bottom, under the erroneous impression that they were stepping upon an imaginary wharf to get at their work better. After this, it blew quite a gale, and the Commodore, at the helm, instinctively kept the boat before the wind, and by so doing, ran over for the opposite island of Omoo. Crossing the channel, by almost a miracle they went straight through an opening in the reef, and shot upon a ledge of coral, where the waters were tolerably smooth. Here they lay until morning, when the natives came off to them in their canoes. By the help of the islanders, the schooner was hove over on her beam ends, when, finding the bottom knocked to pieces, the adventurers sold the boat for a trifle to the chief of the district, and went ashore, rolling before them their precious cask of spirits. Its contents soon evaporated, and they came to Patuaui. The day after encountering these fellows, we were strolling among the groves in the neighborhood, when we came across several parties of natives armed with clumsy muskets, rusty cutlasses, and outlandish clubs. They were beating the bushes, shouting aloud, and apparently trying to scare somebody. They were in pursuit of the strangers, who, having in a single night set at naught all the laws of the place, had thought best to decamp. In the daytime, Popo's house was as pleasant a lounge as one could wish. So, after strolling about, and seeing all there was to be seen, we spent the greater part of our mornings there, breakfasting late, and dining about 2 hours after noon. Sometimes we lounged on the floor of ferns, smoking, and telling stories, of which the doctor had as many as a half-pay captain in the army. Sometimes we chatted, as well as we could, with the natives, and, one day, joy to us, Popo brought in 3 volumes of Smollett's novels, which had been found in the chest of a sailor, who some time previous had died on the island. Amelia, Peregrine, you hero of rogues, Count Fathom, what a debt do we owe you. I know not whether it was the reading of these romances, or the want of some sentimental pastime, which led the doctor, about this period, to lay siege to the heart of the little Lou. Now, as I have said before, the daughter of Popo was most cruelly reserved, and never deigned to notice us. Frequently I addressed her with a long face and an air of the profoundest and most distant respect, but in vain, she wouldn't even turn up her pretty olive nose. Ah! It's quite plain, thought I, she knows very well what graceless dogs sailors are, and won't have anything to do with us. But thus thought not my comrade. bent he was upon firing the cold glitter of Lou's passionless eyes. He opened the campaign with admirable tact, making cautious approaches, and content, for 3 days, with ogling the nymph for about 5 minutes after every meal. On the 4th day, he asked her a question. On the 5th, she dropped a nut of ointment, and he picked it up and gave it to her. On the 6th, he went over and sat down within 3 yards of the couch where she lay, and, on the memorable morn of the 7th, he proceeded to open his batteries in form. The damsel was reclining on the ferns, one hand supporting her cheek, and the other listlessly turning over the leaves of a Tahitian Bible. The doctor approached. Now the chief disadvantage under which he labored was his almost complete ignorance of the love vocabulary of the island. But French counts, they say, make love delightfully in broken English, and what hindered the doctor from doing the same in dulcet Tahitian? So at it he went. "Ah," said he, smiling bewitchingly, "oee missionary, oee ready Bible." No answer, not even a look. "Ah, I mate I, very goody ready Bible missionary." Lou, without stirring, began reading, in a low tone, to herself. "Missionary Bible ready goody mate I," once more observed the doctor, ingeniously transposing his words for the 3rd time. But all to no purpose. Lou gave no sign. He paused, despairingly, but it would never do to give up, so he threw himself at full length beside her, and audaciously commenced turning over the leaves. Lou gave a start, just one little start, barely perceptible, and then, fumbling something in her hand, lay perfectly motionless, the doctor rather frightened at his own temerity, and knowing not what to do next. At last, he placed one arm cautiously about her waist. Almost in the same instant he bounded to his feet, with a cry, the little witch had pierced him with a thorn. But there she lay, just as quietly as ever, turning over the leaves, and reading to herself. My long friend raised the siege incontinently, and made a disorderly retreat to the place where I reclined, looking on. I am pretty sure that Lou must have related this occurrence to her father, who came in shortly afterward, for he looked queerly at the doctor. But he said nothing, and, in 10 minutes, was quite as affable as ever. As for Lou, there was not the slightest change in her, and the doctor, of course, forever afterwards held his peace. Chapter 8. Mrs. Bell one day, taking a pensive afternoon stroll along one of the many bridle paths which wind among the shady groves in the neighborhood of Talou, I was startled by a sunny apparition. It was that of a beautiful young Englishwoman, charmingly dressed, and mounted upon a spirited little white pony. Switching a green branch, she came cantering toward me. I looked round to see whether I could possibly be in Polynesia. There were the palm trees, but how to account for the lady? Stepping to one side as the apparition drew near, I made a polite obeisance. It gave me a bold, rosy look, and then, with a gay air, patted its palfrey, crying out, "Fly away, Willie," and galloped among the trees. I would have followed, but Willie's heels were making such a pattering among the dry leaves that pursuit would have been useless. So I went straight home to Popo's, and related my adventure to the doctor. The next day, our inquiries resulted in finding out that the stranger had been on the island about 2 years, that she came from Sydney, and was the wife of Mr. Bell, Happy Dog, the proprietor of the sugar plantation to which I have previously referred. To the sugar plantation we went, the same day. The country round about was very beautiful, a level basin of verdure, surrounded by sloping hillsides. The sugar cane, of which there was about 100 acres, in various stages of cultivation, looked thrifty. A considerable tract of land, however, which seemed to have been formerly tilled, was now abandoned. The place where they extracted the saccharine matter was under an immense shed of bamboos. Here we saw several clumsy pieces of machinery for breaking the cane, also great kettles for boiling the sugar. But, at present, nothing was going on. 2 or 3 natives were lounging in one of the kettles, smoking. The other was occupied by 3 sailors from the Leviathan, playing cards. While we were conversing with these worthies, a stranger approached. He was a sunburnt, romantic-looking European, dressed in a loose suit of nankeen. His fine throat and chest were exposed, and he sported a Guayaquil hat with a brim like a Chinese umbrella. This was Mr. Bell. He was very civil, showed us the grounds, and, taking us into a sort of arbor, to our surprise, offered to treat us to some wine. People often do the like, but Mr. Bell did more. He produced the bottle. It was spicy sherry, and we drank out of the halves of fresh citron melons. Delectable goblets. The wine was a purchase from the French in Tahiti. Now all this was extremely polite in Mr. Bell. Still, we came to see Mrs. Bell. But she proved to be a phantom, indeed, having left the same morning for Papeete, on a visit to one of the missionaries' wives there. I went home, much chagrined. To be frank, my curiosity had been wonderfully piqued concerning the lady. In the first place, she was the most beautiful white woman I ever saw in Polynesia. But this is saying nothing. She had such eyes, such moss roses in her cheeks, such a divine air in the saddle, that, to my dying day, I shall never forget Mrs. Bell. The sugar planter himself was young, robust, and handsome. So, merrily may the little bells increase, and multiply, and make music in the land of Omoo. Chapter 6. Talu Chapel, holding court in Polynesia in Patuau, is to be seen one of the best constructed and handsomest chapels in the South Seas. Like the buildings of the palace, it stands upon an artificial pier, presenting a semicircular sweep to the bay. The chapel is built of hewn blocks of coral, a substance which, although extremely friable, is said to harden by exposure to the atmosphere. To a stranger, these blocks look extremely curious. Their surface is covered with strange fossil-like impressions, the seal of which must have been set before the flood. Very nearly white when hewn from the reefs, the coral darkens with age, so that several churches in Polynesia now look almost as sooty and venerable as famed St. Paul's. In shape, the chapel is an octagon, with galleries all round. It will seat, perhaps, 400 people. Everything within is stained a tawny red, and there being but few windows, or rather embrasures, the dusky benches and galleries, and the tall spectre of a pulpit look anything but cheerful. On Sundays we always went to worship here. Going in the family suite of Popo, we, of course, maintained a most decorous exterior, and hence, by all the elderly people of the village, were doubtless regarded as pattern young men. Popo's seat was in a snug corner, and it being particularly snug, in the immediate vicinity of one of the palm pillars supporting the gallery, I invariably leaned against it, Popo and his lady on one side, the doctor and the dandy on the other, and the children and poor relations seated behind. As for Lou, instead of sitting, as she ought to have done, by her good father and mother, she must needs run up into the gallery, and sit with a parcel of giddy creatures of her own age, who, all through the sermon, did nothing but look down on the congregation, pointing out, and giggling at the queer-looking old ladies in dowdy bonnets and scant tunics. But Lou, herself, was never guilty of these improprieties. Occasionally during the week they have afternoon service in the chapel, when the natives themselves have something to say, although their auditors are but few. An introductory prayer being offered by the missionary, and a hymn sung, communicants rise in their places, and exhort in pure Tahitian, and with wonderful tone and gesture. And among them all, Deacon Popo, though he talked most, was the one whom you would have liked best to hear. Much would I have given to have understood some of his impassioned bursts, when he tossed his arms overhead, stamped, scowled, and glared, till he looked like the very angel of vengeance. Deluded man, sighed the doctor, on one of these occasions, I fear he takes the fanatical view of the subject. One thing was certain, when Popo spoke,